And we should be live. So, all right. Well, this is exciting.
Yes.
The first ever live book club. And it looks like we have a handful of people on the call, which is excellent. Great. Thank you so much, all of you, for showing up and chipping in. I guess we'll just dive right into this. Do quick introductions. I assume that everybody on the call knows who Joan is, because that's why you're here, essentially, at least on these first couple. But you might not all know who I am. So just briefly, I'm Andreas Anschutz, Joan's son, and sometimes partner in crime. So that's just quickly who I am, but I think in order to keep this on track, because we have a lot of content to cover, I think we should just jump right into the meat of what we're doing. The rough structure of what we want to do, there are two main topics that I think that we're going to talk about on tonight's call, and those are covering perception and basically making people into objects and how that affects our interactions with them, and then also ascribing motivation to people, making up stories and applying those stories to somebody. So those are the two main topics that are found deeper within the Outward Mindset book. But we did talk a little bit about some broad concepts of outward mindset on the last call that we did that was kind of a practice call. So feel free to go back and watch those. You can find those on Joan's site at joanu.com/videos. But it's not necessary to watch if you haven't already. We're going to be talking about other concepts. On this call, I would like to ask you, Mom, you have used this book in the last couple of years for a lot of your kind of required reading, if you will. And I'm curious, what is it that's so important about this particular book that you have recommended it to your clients and your friends and your family members?
Everybody?
Everybody, yeah.
Everybody? Yeah. Well, we talked about this for a while last time too, Andreas, and I've been talking about it with a lot of people because although I'm not directly related to the Arbinger Institute, I really find that their writing, the way they have written this book, is easy for people to read, and they do take on what I think of is complicated subjects in psychology and really applied psychology, and they create a narrative that makes those complicated ideas really come to life and create a pathway for people to understanding that I think is quite unusual. And the book is not huge. It's a small book. And yet they cover, I think, a range of very important topics. So it is the best of applied psychology. And the other thing I really admire about the Arbinger Institute is that they use psychology, or the foundational principles that they use in psychology, I believe, are well documented, and I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to people who really work from what I think of are strong fundamental psychological theories. So that's why I think it's a great book. And it just opens up a lot of questions as well as answering questions. probably opens up more questions than it answers. And I always like that in a book.
Interesting. Yeah, definitely. There are lots of questions. I know I've had lots of questions after reading it. We had talked about on the last call about the meat of the concept within the outward mindset comes down to that the most effective way to influence change and lasting positive change is to change mindset first, and then behavior follows that. But again, I think we talked about that on the last call, so I don't necessarily want to rehash all of that. So let's then get into this idea of perception and turning people into objects, and how that relates to the idea of the outward mindset and the concepts within that book. So, when you brought that concept up to me, I'm curious what you feel is like the core. What do people need to understand about this idea of perception and essentially ascribing motivation to other people and to turn them into objects? Why is that important?
I guess for me it's always been a big learning about understanding how our minds and brains work, and how we sometimes misuse psychology or our understanding of psychology. And all the time that I've worked in consulting, what I've noticed is that there's a way we can learn some if they know the other people's story. If we know a little bit about them, we begin to believe that we know a lot about them and that we can predict their behavior. And also I think it also leads us to a way of, rather than moving toward, or it can anyway, moving toward more insight to people, it creates a model of relationship that's based on manipulation. So if I say, oh, I know so-and-so is acting in a passive-aggressive way, and that he's always passive-aggressive, and you can just count on him responding in that way, then pretty soon I've taken a language, applied it to another person, and created a mental model of predictability about their behavior. And although somebody may act in a way that's passive and then aggressive, it doesn't mean they always will, and neither does it mean it's a predictive behavior. But once you get there, once you decide that's how that person is, then you begin to look for that pattern. And as soon as you begin to look for that pattern will begin to show up more. And that's what I mean by creating, the other person becomes an object then. You're no longer curious about what other ways they might respond, or what are you missing, or what might be helpful. You have a very narrow focus, and you begin to create a story that you can predict their behavior off of a very small, what I call snapshot of information. So when we do that, what happens is then we begin to think about people as though we know them, and then we can begin to ascribe motivation to that behavior. We can not only predict what it's going to be, but then we can begin to say we know why that person is acting like that. We can create a story about why they act that way.
So those two
whether
things,
it's or not.
those two things of basically viewing that person as an object and then ascribing motivation to that person they're linked. They're not separate activities or separate processes. Would you say that they're inherently linked, or?
Well, not always, but a part of this that's really helpful to kind of look at our own behavior is, for example, let's take a story that I just worked with. In a practice, a person came to, was late for work, and she had been late for work 3 or 4 weeks. And one of the people on the team then was really upset about it because it meant she had to do more work, and that she began to make up a story, and her story was that her team member really didn't care about her job, and that she really didn't have a good work ethic, and she didn't care about the other team members, or she wouldn't be late. And the other part, then she began to make up a story that she's probably going to leave the practice anyway. None of those things were really true. But once she began to believe that, then she talked with other people about it, and now we have 2 people or 3 people believing in a story that ascribes motivation and what the next person's behavior is going to be. In fact, you really don't have that information.
So this seems like it's an issue that comes up because we create mental models of things in order to simplify our lives. That is, we as humans are pretty dang good at doing that.
Yes.
And yet it gets us into trouble. It seems like this is one of those times that it gets us into trouble, in that we act on very limited information that we have and come to conclusions about situations with limited information. Knowing that that's necessary, knowing that that's a natural part of the process, that is being human, is coming to conclusions with limited information. Yes. How do we limit the negative impact of that while not overburdening ourselves with trying to know everything?
Well, I think that, again, is we're talking about at least I ask people to read this book because I'm really interested in helping people work together in groups.
Right.
And one of the pieces about working together in groups is I've always been curious about what really supports collaboration. How do we learn to be collaborative? And one of the parts of learning, or one of the skills and techniques of learning to be collaborative, is really this insight about changing the way that you come to looking at the world. That when you come to things through an open mindset, it's really different than if you come to it with an inward mindset. Or, when my mindset is outward, one of the things that happens is I'm practicing creating an intention. I'm working from the front of my brain. When I'm reacting to it, I'm really acting out of that fight or flight phenomenon. Something's gone wrong. This isn't good. How do we fix it? Who's to blame? And so you're in a different kind of spiral of conversation. But if you can, take a breath and stay in an outward mindset, you then have a possibility of staying curious about that person and wondering, I wonder why Joan was late 3 times in the last 4 weeks. I wonder what's going on. And is there anything that we can do or need that it could be helpful for her, in that process? That's really different than seeing that person being late as it's all about me and it makes my life harder. When I move to an inward mindset, I'm really focused all about me. If
Sure.
I can stay in an outward mindset, I then can stay at least curious. I may not be yet able to solve it, but I can stay curious. And when I can stay curious, then I don't have to go to who's to blame, what's wrong, and who's to blame. I can then begin to have what I think of is there are just more possibilities of understanding.
Okay, so I think there's lots of opportunity in that example of somebody who's been showing up late consistently to jump to the conclusion of this person isn't dedicated to their job.
Right.
Otherwise, they would make sure to show up on time. How would you suggest approaching that particular situation, or any situation really, where someone is acting in a way that's indicating that they're not doing what they're being asked to do?
Well, that one for me is really quite easy. Although you might think it's difficult, but the easy process is to ask them, to be able to say, I've noticed, Andreas, you know, that the last 3 weeks you've been late a few times, and it looks like a pattern has been developing, and I'm curious what's happened, and how is it that we can understand what's going on for you, and just be able to listen to what's happening first of all, because I don't know and I don't want to make up more of a story. The second part of that is I don't necessarily want to let the person off the hook. I don't want to just say, oh, well, that's okay, be late. What I really want to be able to say is you matter to me, and your being on time is important to all of us. How do we make that happen? So
that's the hard route, though. Having that conversation isn't an easy thing to do. It sounds easy, but emotionally, for me at least, that would be a really hard conversation to have.
Yes. So part of when you think about outward mindset is thinking about it's the practice. It's the practice of asking the questions, having that difficult conversation of acknowledging. So let's say that this person who's been late, if you treat her as an object, you then begin to ascribe motivation. But if you treat her as a person, you stay curious and you just wonder what's going on. And is something happening that she's unintentionally late, or she's not paying attention, or something? We have no idea what's going on. So staying curious about what's going on. She is a person. That's what shifts that conversation. It isn't magic, and it doesn't mean it will end up well.
Yeah, I guess it's not magic, but it's certainly not easy. I think it's not easy as an individual to be in that space.
So maybe that's what I'm asking of you and other people, is to step into that difficulty. That's what I think of as radical responsibility, is that I'm willing to ask that question. I'm willing to step into it and ask the question and engage. So it's a much higher level engagement rather than step back. And actually step away, when we objectify people, we step back and create a lot of distance.
Sure.
So that is not easy, and in terms of it's a pattern that you do get to practice, right? The part that makes it not so easy is that you have to practice vulnerability.
Okay, sure.
And vulnerability is that aspect of us that is deeply human. We connect through our vulnerability.
So that actually, I think that's a really good segue. Sorry, I think that's a really good segue into some of the questions that we've received. One of the bigger ones being, how do we help other people transition and start to, I guess, encourage other people to be in an outward mindset, as opposed to when, let's say in this example, if when you approach that person, their response is consistent with an inward mindset of, oh, I have all these issues that are going on. I can't make it because I have this, and this going on, and it's maybe the schedule that you've created doesn't reflect my needs in my life, or regardless of what the response is specifically, how do we help maybe the other people on the team start to cultivate more of an outward mindset to realize their impact within the greater team?
Well, I guess the first way is that I think that the part that is really impactful is that I will change my behavior without ever expecting everybody else to change their behavior. There's no agreement or expectation that everybody has to be in an outward mindset before I decide that's the way I'm going to operate.
That could be frustrating, though.
Yes, I think it can be frustrating because of the expectation that somehow if you make the effort, then everybody else should make the effort back. But if you took another way of thinking about it, and that is that your preferred way of being in the world is status, and to regard others as though they are curious and fully functioning people, and that's the way you're going to regard people, then you don't have to have people reflect back to you that behavior all the time. The world doesn't have to reflect it back to you. But your influence your modeling is a powerful influence on other people. So you get to have a choice which way you're going to influence. And I've always wanted to choose the influence of moving toward the vulnerability. That's another way of thinking about outward mindset. It's moved toward that which is the vulnerability.
Interesting. I haven't thought about it that way. And when you say it that way, it becomes obvious that you have to consistently model that behavior without expecting other people, like you said, to reflect that back to you. It's
right.
There might be a desire for that to happen, but it can't be an expectation.
So if what I do is I begin to expect that you have to perform in a particular way, or you have to regard the situation out of that same model, then I'm objectifying you. You have, because I want it, and I want it to look like this, you're now an object to me. Rather than being curious and being able to say, I wonder how this is going to work for him. Or how it influences.
I'm wondering if there are any indicators that people can maybe... I'm just wondering if there's anything that might pop up in your conversations with people where you can say, oh, that's an indication that I'm operating out of an inward mindset, and I prefer to be operating out of an outward mindset.
Well, I excuse me. I have several little ways I check myself. Where am I? I mean, it's something that I ask myself all the time, and so that we all could find our own checks. And one of the things I check myself with is, am I making up a story? and I do that. I will immediately go in and think that I can figure this out, and I'll make up a great big story. And then it's really helpful for me to laugh and say, oh, nice try, Joan. That was a great story. The problem is, if you begin to believe that story, Joan, you are now 2 steps into a process of which you don't know any of it's true. You have no way of understanding that except for the way you're projecting on that story. I'm projecting it out there. I'm making the story up, and now I begin to act as though the story's true. It's just helpful to check yourself and say, is it true? And the little thing I say to myself, is it true? Is it really true? Is it really, really true? And oftentimes I can kind of trick myself into saying, yeah, it's true. And then when I say, is it really true? And by the time I get to really, really true, I then begin to catch myself in recognizing that my part in it. I think that's really helpful to recognize, a way for me to recognize what's my part in this process.
Sure. Now, okay, so the short answer to that question would be, you don't help the way that you help other people transition into a more outward mindset is by modeling outward mindset behavior.
Yes. And giving them the book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's my next question. But can you have a conversation about this in a way that isn't demeaning or isn't objectifying and saying, well, you're a part of my team, you have to now read this and, act in this way. How do you bring that conversation up in a way that's motivating for people and allows them to grow personally, as we all are? We're all in this process together. Nobody's, I don't think anybody is perfect along this. Perhaps the Dalai Lama. But what are the ways that we can help? Maybe not in those continuing conversations, but how do you even get started in this, as opposed to just simply handing somebody a book and says, I think you should read this?
Well, maybe let's start on a developmental continuum. That's the way my mind works anyway. So, first of all, I don't know what the context is, but let's say the context is we're going to develop a work group. And we're going to call that work group our team. And one of the elements of developing a work group can be creating agreements with each other about how we're going to manage our structures, how we're going to work with agreement or disagreement, so that we begin to self-create in our group our operating agreements. And when you first do that, they're pretty simple. Everybody is part of it, and part of developing that is then over time in a work group, really being able to be generative to create operating agreements that work for that group. And one of the operating agreements is the agreement, the commitment is to stay in it as open in our mindset as we can as we move in this process. That can be an agreement.
Yes, but you're coming. Look, how do you get there if, let's say, your team members aren't as enlightened as you are and haven't read the book and don't even know about the idea of an outward mindset?
I think that you just start modeling what you want to have happen. And when you model that behavior, it changes other people's behavior. Curiosity and looking at possibility and using that pattern over and over and over again changes the way people come to it. So if you don't have a direct route of operating or suggesting or co-creating, then the indirect or the implied process is by modeling. It's slower, but it's just as effective. It does take some time. But over a period of time, all the research shows that in small groups, people will shift toward that what's called the predominant social behavior. So if the dominant social behavior is collaborative, then you're going to begin to see the behavior within the group move toward a collaborative behavior. If it's competitive, behavior moves toward a competitive behavior. So the influence of a leader or a team coach or even any member of a group is you can influence a group. It's called the social field. You can influence by your behavior. That's a slow way to do that.
What's the fast way?
Well, the fast way is to bring it to language again and to create agreements, being able to say, you don't have to talk about having open mindset because, for example, one of the things we always say is we expect you to be a team leader. But what you can do with that is then say, what is it? Or we want you to be a team player. Well, being a team player is a pretty radical job. If you really want to be a team player from a collaborative point of view, because a team player really is invested in doing the very best that they can and supporting the other people to be the best that they can be. A team player is not just doing my best. That isn't a team player. A team player is really, when you talk about it collaboratively, is doing my best and doing it in a way that helps everybody else be best. And that's difficult because in our culture, we're just learning that a team player isn't just doing my job. And you see that all the time in sports where you have, people who are just remarkably talented people. And, but 5 talented basketball players does not make a necessarily competitive group that can play together, that can cooperate and collaborate. So there is something else that's happening in that group, and the same way is true in the workplace or in families. That part of being willing to look at that deeper commitment, and that is how do I bring the best of myself, and how do I create an environment that's really best for the people that I work with. The corollary or the other side of that is when things aren't going well, what part am I doing in it? That is, am I part of what's making this thing not work? Am I the barrier? Am I the shortstop? Am I somehow creating the way I'm doing my job really sets up a lack of success for the other person's job? Does that make sense? So, for example, one of the things always in healthcare is the part of time, when we manage time, and if I don't manage my time well, and I then make your more difficult without recognition that that's happening. And that I don't see it as my job then to be able to say, gee, having us be on time or me keeping my time commitment is helping you be successful. And if you're successful, the people that we care about, the patients, win much more than in another kind of scenario. That's pretty radical conversations. And yet, it's powerful. It's not magic, and it's doable. So one of the things I like about this book is it demystifies what it means to be a good team member.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we're at 37 past the hour. I want to probably spend the rest of this time that we have talking about specific questions that have been brought up.
Okay.
So we have talked about one, and that is how can I help other people cultivate an outward mindset. The next one is that I'm not sure, say, how my particular outward mindset supports the other people on my team being, and this one's in quotes, the fully responsible. So how do I take as a leader, my role essentially is to help people be as effective as possible. But if they're not taking responsibility for their own work, how does an outward mindset support that? And support me changing that? Or support them in changing that more accurately?
Well, I think that one of I could answer in lots of different ways, but one of the ways I think is important to recognize is that fundamentally I would ask the question, has that person been engaged in creating the work systems? That is, are the work systems that we're using to get work done, have they been engaged in developing those work systems? And they feel committed then to those work systems supporting them. You know, we only have systems in order to get stuff done. So one of the most important elements that I first look at is, do the systems support people getting the work done? And so I would ask that person, are there issues within the system? Is the issue within the system and the interaction of that person? That is, another system might work better, or is it their difficulty in adapting to that system? Is there a learning process? So for me, I would go into that process of someone not meeting agreed upon standards, like here's what we're supposed to be doing, and we're not meeting them. I would go into that with some curiosity about how is the system supporting it? If they created a different system, would that be helpful? Do they have some insights into what's going to make a difference for them? That is, how is it that it could change, or what is the change element? And the other part of it I think is really important is that if I can come to it not with blaming, people don't have to be resistant or blame other people, but also that I can, with great care and love, be able to challenge someone if they step away from their responsibility. Like, I've had people say to me, well, that's not my job. And that I often have to say, well, help me understand that it's not your job. How do you understand that? That what part of it is your job and what part of it isn't your job. So I'm very willing to stay in it and engage in the conversation about, where do we find that quality of responsibility? But I don't think of it as holding people responsible. I really think about it as opening the possibility for people to be responsible, creating a pathway toward higher levels of responsibility. Soon as I think my job is to hold you responsible, I objectify you. That's an objectifying process. And I stop being curious. And I stop being creative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and I feel that rings true from my own experience. And I suppose it also, I'm just trying to think of how there's a way in which hold the sense of that your superior, if you will, is holding you responsible for the work that you're doing. That responsibility then is placed upon you.
Right.
And a placement of responsibility upon somebody doesn't, I think it rarely, I don't know this, but my intuitive sense is that it rarely increases motivation.
Responsibility increases motivation when it comes from the inside. When I feel responsible, that increases motivation. Very seldom does external motivation, external placement of external responsibility or more like rules, very seldom does it increase motivation. It increases compliance, but all the research, there is not a lot of research around the way that it would increase motivation, because motivation is internal. You can have compliance behavior. That's the difference between internal, I think the whole idea of inward mindset is recognizing that motivation is an inside-out process. But the way, I think about it, my shorthand always in working through processes like this is be soft on people and hard on problems. Because you really want to solve the issue. You want to stay really curious about how do we solve the issue. But we don't have to be hard on people about it. But that's not how most people begin to look at accountability. The tendency is to be really hard on people, and the problem continues to be unresolved. And you get to recycle that issue over and over and over again. So if you think about it, it really is a way of refocusing. If you can be soft on people and be hard on problems, let's resolve let's find the solution or the next or whatever the design or whatever our project is. Let's have our focus there. Does that make sense when I say it in that way?
It does, yeah.
So when you say how do you learn to do it, that's another way I remind myself. Is you have the opportunity to decide where you're going to put your attention, where you're going to put your focus. So my focus is be soft on people, understand what's going on in the human dynamics, and stay focused on also let's understand how we solve the problem.
Yeah, I think it sounds like that requires, if the crux of the outward mindset in challenging work environments comes down to asking the difficult questions.
Yes. I think so.
Or at least asking the curious questions, staying curious and asking the questions about what is actually going on. That also requires the skill of listening and hearing what people are saying. And that's got to be the topic of 4 or 5 other calls, because we can't get into that. But
this is something that I just realized in this conversation after our many conversations is the cultivation of vulnerability. That if I learn to be willing to be more and more vulnerable, I can stay curious. Because I don't have to be perfect as a leader. I don't have to have all the answers. I don't have to have all the control. And that I can begin to recognize that it is really in the connections that I'm going to have more influence. And I have 2 focuses. One is if we're soft on people and hard on problems, we want to get done what we came for. This isn't kumbaya, right? It isn't outcomes. We want stuff to happen. That's why we came together, even to do this project. So the way sometimes you've held me accountable, or you've been kind in the way that you've said, I thought we were going to do this. Has it changed? Or whatever happens in that supports us moving the project along.
yeah, I like the hard on problems, tough or soft on people. Tough on problems, soft on people.
It's a good way to keep our focus, or refocus sometimes. That's what I find is helpful, is refocus.
So that's
and also to help people recognize that when we're hard on each other, we tend to close the human system down. So we have less capacity to be inventive, or to be creative, or to have a different solution. As soon as we begin emotionally to be blameful and disrespectful for people, you begin to create what's called a closed social field. And you can feel that, or you've been in situations. I've been in lots of situations where I'm the facilitator, and I ask a question and not one person says one word, like no one's going to speak. And even after being with them for, an hour and a half, people will then say, they'll say something like this, well, this is just my opinion. Or I know this doesn't matter, but I was thinking this. because they're so accustomed to being in a closed system. Does that, when I say that, that's the part that I was going to say, that if you really think about leadership, it is both and. It is getting the problem done, but if you close a system down, you decrease the possibility or the probability that you're going to get all the chances to resolve it. Now, not all issues have to be resolved with creative answers, but most of the complex questions are. That was a rabbit hole. I think you're probably thinking, hurry up, Joan. So, okay. I got it.
No, it's helpful for sure. I do think that's a good segue, though. I mean, we talked a little bit, or you mentioned about systems and how systems, they're either supportive or detrimental to outward mindset. Can you go into how do we start to develop those systems that are very supportive to an outward mindset on, for the whole team?
I've just really began to think about in ways. So this is I've always had an answer for this question, but I now I'm going to hesitate a little bit because I have some new thinking and insights that I'm trying to develop. And so one way I think that systems work best is when they're created by the people who use them, or there's influence onto the system by the people who are using the system. The other thing that's really important about systems is that systems are effective and efficient when everybody understands the goal of the system. Even though we may not create the system, what we can begin to understand is, again, the bigger picture, and be curious about what are we trying to do or accomplish with this system. What's helpful. So, for example, one of the systems that people use all the time are spreadsheets, or profit and loss sheets to say, well, how are we doing this quarter or this month in our business? And I think it's really helpful to begin to, first of all, say, well, there's a common profit and loss sheet that everybody uses. Is that a helpful tool, or is there another way that we could bring that information and it would be more helpful to everybody? And if we're looking at the profit and loss, what are we looking for? Why would we be looking at it? And what are we looking for? What are we hoping that we will learn in it? What are the curious questions? So, when you think about that system of, we have a financial meeting in our company, and we go over the profit and loss, and we say simple things like, oh, we did great, or not so good this month, or look at this. But we really don't use that system in a way of really addressing the bigger questions. And that is, well, relative to how are we doing? What does this mean? And are there any insights for us in these numbers? Yeah. Are they simply we've just collected this data, and it's historical data, and it tells us what we've done. But the other thing is, does it tell us what we should be doing? Is there any insight to it, or is that another kind of data point that we need? But often in financial conversations, in small businesses particularly, we'll look at that financial system of profit and loss. We'll be able to say what we did historically, but we really won't use that system in a way that might be the most helpful. Yeah. So that, I think an inward mindset is really about what's in it for me, the outward mindset system is, well, how does this help us make better decisions? That's a different way of viewing that meeting. And is the data helpful? Is there another way to even look at the data that would make it helpful?
That's a big topic.
That is.
Yeah. Maybe that's a part 3 of this.
That's another time. But when you said I'm just trying to help you or help me think out loud, thank you for the question. And I've been thinking about it quite differently in the last 6 months or so. So stay tuned. I'll have a better answers in the next 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of, when it comes to, say, like financials, oftentimes in the startup realm, that would be considered a quote-unquote vanity metric. Because a metric that it's data, but it's data that you can't use to actually affect a change. And really, the metrics that you need to be tracking are the metrics that you can isolate in a way that give you information that can say what we did was the right thing to do. It was better than the previous month or the previous unit of time, or it wasn't. And how do we change in order to make it better? But again, that's a huge topic.
Yeah, it is, and maybe we'll go there or maybe not. So what's our closing question?
So yeah, we only have a few minutes. This one's actually, I think, really good in that it gets to our desire to be in this space when we are confronted with so much negativity. But how can we live joyfully and productively when we're surrounded by so much inward mindset?
Well, that's I think the existential question of our time, and maybe not, maybe just historically now we're aware of it. But here's the way that I've been thinking about that question. I think that there is a lot of cultural difference, and there are lots of different sections culturally right now, and some of it's negative, and some of it is amazingly expansive and comes out of an outward mindset. And so, although I know there's inward mindset, my optimism comes from recognizing that there is an enormous amount of energy around that which is possible and creativity. You know, we are in one of the most creative times in humanity. And so my deepest sense of being rounds into that I know that we are in a time of possibility and creativity. I know there's also a lot of negativity, but I'm going to put my focus where that creative possible spirit is. And I always think it's right out on the edge. So when people say, how do you do that? What I say is to myself, stay out on the creative edge. Where's the learning? You know, there's that phenomenon that the learning is out on the edge of the culture. And so that's where I want to work. That's who I want to, that's the influence place for me. although I can get discouraged, I don't feel overwhelmed by the amount of inward mindset. I feel much more encouraged because of the nature of creativity. There is so much creativity in the whole world emerging, and possibility that, I am much more optimistic than that statement might make.
Yeah.
And so you might, I don't want that to be everything is wonderful. But the work, it's right work. When someone says, how do you keep doing the work? 'Cause it's right work. It's good work. It's a way that calls me to focus. I'm called to that edge, to the creative edge. That's what I would say to it today, and it might change tomorrow.
Yeah, one of the things that came up for me as you were saying that was this idea of moving, is that we're always searching for perfection or at least I am someone who wants to have systems that run flawlessly.
Yeah, me
and
too.
what that means is anything that doesn't happen flawlessly is seen as a negative, is seen as not being tuned just right. And I think therein lies, for me, a kind of a core issue that I need to get over, the idea that this thing can be perfect. And if, say, somebody else didn't do the thing that I thought they were going to do exactly the way that I thought they were going to do it, doesn't mean that that's not the way that it should have been done. It's just not my view of a perfect system.
Yes.
And so I think that idea of staying open to possibility is a big one for me. And seeing potential.
And so, as we tie this up, I want to say to you, Andreas, thank you so much for doing this project with me.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. I mean, having the opportunity
to you were the one who saw the possibility.
Well,
yeah, you saw the opportunity and the creativity. So I find that I cherish this time together, and I hope that we continue to adventure in this process together. So thank you for the questions and supporting this dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to thank all the people who who submitted questions. Absolutely. And Mom, thanks for taking the time to answer all these questions. I love picking your brain about these things. But I guess we should talk. We're a little over time. Let's talk about the next one. I think we have chosen the next book to do. So next month, same time. So the first Tuesday of next month we're doing. So June 5th, same time, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be talking about the 5 keys to mindful communication. I don't have that book with me because we just decided on it, but yeah, let's show that one. But we'll have a link for that, actually. I think we'll send a link out in the newsletter, so if you aren't on Joan's newsletter, jump on that. You can find a sign-up link, I think, on my homepage of JoanU.com. And, yeah, we'll catch up June 5th, 5 p.m. Pacific. So.
And if anybody wants to talk about outward mindsets, or you have questions, contact me by email or give me a call. And thanks so much for this conversation and participating. And be well and good night.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Andreas.
Good night.
Bye.